The last page, or tab, is the Advanced tab that I'm going to talk about now, because there's several features on here that are very useful in your production. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Advance After Plot. Now what is this? This is simply after it cuts the job, it advances to the end of the job. Now there's two things you can do from here. Number one, you can send a secondary job so that you're not cutting right over the first job. That's the first benefit to it. The second benefit, as you can see here, is I've turned on my crosscut feature, and this is available only in the FC7000. The CE5000, you can still advance after the plot, but if you're doing a crosscut, you have to take the knife and cut across the material. But what I like about this is that if I've got several repeat jobs that I'm trying to get out, like if I'm making multiple decals, I can go ahead and have it find the registration mark, cut the job, and then slice it off at the end, which is kind of a neat feature to have, to keep things clean and neat. Then you have this additional advance. Now, you may have different uses for this. It's basically what it is after it advances the plot, it goes ahead and advances a further distance of whatever value is in here. So in this case, it would advance to the end of the plot, which is where the C is on the Graphtec, and then advance another 24 inches. Now, in my case, what I often do is when I print and cut a job, or I cut a job, and I'm taking it someplace, I may want some extra material to wrap around the material so the actual job is protected. So here I've added 24 inches, so it'll advance the job, advance it 24 inches, do a crosscut, then I can roll up the job so that I can have that extra 24 inches wrap around my material, or around my job to protect it. That's just one application. You may think of other applications as well. The next section here is the weed lines. Now, weed borders are very handy in that instead of trying to cut a weed border around it, it'll do it automatically so that you can simply remove the material without taking a lot of waste or using up time cutting the weed border yourself, especially on larger jobs. Now, we simplified the process even further by adding horizontal weed lines and vertical weed lines, in that if I click this on, you'll notice that all of a sudden there's these red lines that appear in between the lines. And what it does is it looks for gaps within the weed border where it can pass a line through, so it keeps the weeding simple. So in this case, what I can do is I can weed out the G by itself, weed out the R and the A, rather than trying to take the whole job and weed it all at once. If I have a larger job, this is a simplification that can't be missed because it's very helpful in your larger cut jobs where you need excessive amount of weeding. This feature, Optimized Cutting Order, is something that I really like. You know, oftentimes when you cut a job, what it does is it starts at one letter, goes to a next, jumps up here, and then comes back and just goes all over the place. Very inefficient way of cutting in my eyes. So what we added is this Optimized Cutting Order, where if I click on Speed Priority, what it's going to do is the objects will be cut in an order that maximizes the cutting speed. So it'll speed up the process because it'll make it more efficient. So in this case, instead of jumping all over the place, it'll start with a G, R, A, P, H, T, E, C and just continue on progressively because that's the fastest way of cutting this job. But there's times where you want to restrict the media movement, and you want to cut it in a way where the media won't be moving back and forth as much as you would desire. The next selection is this Restrict Media Movement. And what this is basically the objects that will be cut will be put in an order that minimizes the amount that the media has to move. If I had a couple G's over here, a couple Graphtecs, instead of going up and doing it the quick way, it'll actually go from this G to this G to this G and then do R. For instance, if I had 3 copies here, it'll switch from here and go back and forth like this because that reduces the media movement. If I had it to speed priority in that sense, what it would probably do is do the G, R, A, P, H, T, E, C and then come back and do the second one and the third copy. Just a little feature that you may want to turn on. On smaller jobs, I wouldn't worry about it. This is more imperative when you're doing larger jobs. Now, the number of passes is kind of a neat feature in that if you have, like, say, a thick lamination where you need to cut the job twice or 3 times, you can do that. So if I have a lamination here, it'll cut it once and then cut it twice and cut it 3 times. And like I said, it's basically for material that's hard to cut through, where you need a couple passes before you can actually get through the material. And this is a common practice too, so don't be afraid to use this if you need to. Number of units, whether you're in feet, millimeters, centimeters, or meters, you can choose which units you want to use. After output, you can have it put on hold or you can delete it. Now, I always like to have it on hold just in case if something goes wrong. Then I can resend the job without having to go back into Cutting Master 2 and resend the job from there. I can go to the queue that we talked about earlier and do it that way. Now, step size is very important. As I mentioned before, step size has to do with the number of points per inch. So in this case, it's 1,016 points per inch, which is pretty standard. But the problem is that you have 4 different resolutions. So if my resolution on my cutter is different from what the plotter sends or the software sends, then it's going to cause a scaling problem. So you always want to make sure your plotter is set correctly, exactly what this is set. Some people ask me why I would want to use 254 points as opposed to 2,540 points, and that just depends on you. If I'm doing small intricate cutting like characters, I usually use 2,540 points because it gives a smoother edge. It just means that the cutting is a little bit slower. 254, if you go into lower resolutions, it enables you to actually output faster and a faster throughput output if need be. And then what I like to use personally is I just choose 1016 because that's basically a standard or generic size that you can use. But once again, just make sure your plotter is set up exactly at that resolution. The last section here has to do with using registration marks. Now keep in mind that if I didn't have registration marks on my job, then this would just be disappear. So if you don't see it, that means that you haven't created your registration marks, or you may have put them on a different layer. Something happened, so you have to check that out. But you want to make sure that's checked on if you have registration marks, and you can see that they show up. And now you can see the registration marks on the 4 corners.